Tisha B'Av in 1942 was the exact date, that's the 23rd of July 1942, corresponding to the 9th of Av 5702, on which mass deportations by the Nazis of Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto to the Treblinka extermination camp commenced. There are three literary laureates of the Shoah, two of whom ultimately committed suicide, none of which are still with us, namely Elie Wiesel, Primo Levi and Paul Celan. Wiesel and Levi were largely writers of prose. Celan, born in Romania, was principally a poet whose work was, ironically, first published in German. I will be sharing a series of musical interpretations of Celan's poem entitled Todesfuge, or Death Fugue, written by Jews and Gentiles of a variety of nationalities, encompassing a wide range of musical styles, but all of which succeed, albeit in different ways, in penetrating the horrors described in the poem and endured by the victims, the survivors, and succeeding generations. Paul Celan, who wrote under the pseudonym Paul Celan, was born in Czernowitz in Romania in 1920. The son of German-speaking Jews, Celan grew up speaking several languages, including Romanian, Russian and French. He also understood Yiddish. He studied medicine in Paris in 1938, but returned to Romania shortly before the outbreak of World War II. His parents were deported and eventually died in Nazi labor camps. Celan himself was interned for 18 months before escaping to the Red Army. In 1945, he moved to Bucharest and became friends with many of the leading Romanian writers of the time. There he also began to publish his own poems and translations under a series of pen names. In 1947, he settled on the pseudonym Celan, which is an anagram of Ansel, the Romanian form of his surname. He lived briefly in Vienna before settling in Paris in 1948 to study German philology and literature. In 1970, Celan died by suicide. So the first thing we should do is to listen to the poem. Here it is in the German version with English subtitles.
Schwarze Milch der Frühe, wir trinken sie abends, wir trinken sie mittags und morgens, wir trinken sie nachts, wir trinken und trinken. Wir schaufeln an grabenden Lüften, da liegt man nicht eng. Ein Mann wohnt im Haus, der spielt mit den Schlangen, der schreibt, wenn es dunkel nach Deutschland, ein goldenes Haar, Margarete. Er schreibt es und tritt vor das Haus, und es blitzen die Sterne, er pfeift seine Rüden herbei. Er pfeift seine Juden hervor, lässt schaufeln an grabende Erde. Er befiehlt uns, spiel auf nun zum Tanz. Schwarze Milch der Frühe, wir trinken dich nachts, wir trinken dich morgens und mittags, wir trinken dich abends, wir trinken und trinken. Ein Mann wohnt im Haus, der spielt mit den Schlangen, der schreibt, wenn es dunkel nach Deutschland, ein goldenes Haar, Margarete. Dein aschenes Haar, Sulamit, wir schaufeln an grabenden Lüften, da liegt man nicht eng. Er ruft, stecht tiefer ins Erdreiche einen. Er andet, singet und spielt. Er greift nach dem eisernen Gurt, er schwingt's, seine Augen sind blau. Stecht tiefer die Spaten ihr einen. Er anden spielt weiter zum Tanz auf. Schwarze Milch der Frühe, wir trinken dich nachts, wir trinken dich mittags und morgens, wir trinken dich abends, wir trinken und trinken. Ein Mann wohnt im Haus, dein goldenes Haar, Margarete, dein aschenes Haar, Sulamit. Er spielt mit den Schlangen, er ruft, spielt süßer den Tod. Der Tod ist ein Meister aus Deutschland. Er ruft, streicht dunkler die Geigen, dann steigt ihr aus Rauch in die Luft. Dann habt ihr einen grabenden Wogen, da liegt man nicht eng. Schwarze Milch der Frühe, wir trinken dich nachts, wir trinken dich mittags, der Tod ist ein Meister aus Deutschland. Wir trinken dich abends und morgens, wir trinken und trinken. Der Tod ist ein Meister aus Deutschland, sein Auge ist blau. Er trifft dich mit bleierner Kugel, er trifft dich genau. Ein Mann wohnt am Haus, dein goldenes Haar, Margareta. Er hetzt seine Rüden auf uns, er schenkt uns grabende Luft. Er spielt mit den Schlangen und träumt mit. Der Tod ist ein Meister aus Deutschland. Dein goldenes Haar, Margareta. Dein aschenes Haar, Sulamit.
Literary scholar Ulrich Baer says this about the poem. Paul Celan's Todesfuge, or Death Fugue, was originally written in Romanian in 1944, put in its final form in 1945, then translated into German in 1948, the date of its first publication. In this version, the poem has become widely known as is frequently invoked as a principal instance of Holocaust poetry. It juxtaposes and provocatively links the two German achievements of masterful artistry and unprecedented mass murder. Some commentators view Todesfuge as having made a similar impact on the literary world as Picasso's Guernica did for visual art. Celan bases his poem on the cyclical theme and repetition musical model of a Baroque fugue, though the original intention was to reference the tango played by the camp orchestras as fellow inmates were marched to their deaths. The poem's central image depicts Jewish prisoners forced to dig their graves and play music while being told that they will rise like smoke in the air. Celan declares that death is a gangmaster from Germany. He based Todesfuge on accounts by survivors of concentration camps returning to Romania in late 1944. He describes no particular camp, but invokes an unspecified, murderous setting outside of Germany, where individual agency and perspective all but vanish in the numbing monotony of forced labourers toiling on the brink between life and death. The poem's rhythm is propelled by a haunting refrain of "Black milk of daybreak, we drink it at nightfall." The recurring line introduces a series of stark and quasi-surrealist images recounted in the present tense by an unidentified we, which presumably encompasses all Jewish victims of the Holocaust. Each of the poem's 6 stanzas includes disturbingly concrete descriptions of a man, alternately writing to his sweetheart in Germany, playing with snakes, whistling his dogs, swinging an iron bat, ordering his Jews to dig and to sing, and shooting them with perfect aim. In this decidedly modernist poem, sentence fragments are spliced and recombined to create the impression of a scene of suffering, fear, and death that is at once chaotic and random, yet entirely self-contained. At the time of publication, Todesfuge had become central to debates about the possibility of writing poetry after Auschwitz, which German philosopher Theodor Adorno had famously declared to be barbaric. Since Celan feared that his poem might be misunderstood as whitewashing German crimes or overcoming the Holocaust by means of art, he stressed the literalness of his images. The poem contains both explicit and oblique references to German and Jewish literary sources. Its rhythmic structure is a decidedly modernist adaptation of a long tradition of dances of death in works as diverse as medieval verse, the poetry of Heinrich Heine, and the lyric modernism of Georg Trakl. Although Todesfuge is a severe indictment of the notion of German-Jewish coexistence, it refuses to forsake the artistic achievements often associated with the German tradition, or to uncouple these achievements from Jewish influence. Celan places the German camp commander's golden hair Margarete from Goethe's Faust tragedy next to and ultimately contrasts her with an ashen-haired Shulamit from the Song of Songs. Celan even employs the Nazi cynicism: "We are digging a grave in the air so that we won't lie too cramped," to assert his right to speak on behalf of Jewish survivors and to condemn the German crimes all the more severely by relying on artistic means associated with German culture. The deceptively straightforward poem becomes a powerful dirge for the Jewish victims of German violence through Celan's technique of layering several contradictory meanings into a single compacted image. So to the music. In his 1987 book, the morbidly titled Death Set to Music, Yale theology professor Paul Celan invokes these short verses by Elder Olson. Music, oldest of arts, unlike all others, moves immediately upon the mind, presents no lyre for pity, no awakening Adam for wonder. We exult or grieve, unable to say why. How a man became music, we became that music. All the many listeners became one, differences like discords resolved in concord. Nor can we say how it was that suffering, thought, toil became the fleeting touch of a fingertip, how the insensate instrument shook the insensate air to make passion into sound, sound into passion. In other words, music, whether utilized in the service of text or presented as an abstract form, has the ability to convey narrative, meaning, and emotion without reference to any visual or spoken imagery. The various musical interpretations of the words and ideas contained in Celan's Todesfuge that you will hear over the next few minutes are extraordinarily diverse and perhaps, just as the poem does, give the lie to Adorno's assertion that writing poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. We should note, however, that I've selected these pieces with care from a much larger group. Some regard the Shoah as in some way sacred, and that in that regard great care is needed to ensure that it isn't trivialized. To engage creatively with such a momentous and apocalyptic episode requires the ability to understand its enormity and importance and respond accordingly and with empathy. I could easily have provided you with examples of what I term as Holocaust porn, music that in my view does trivialize and desecrate our understanding of the event. Matthias Fuhrmeister is an actor and singer from Düsseldorf, a town in West Germany, near to the border with Holland and Belgium, and a few kilometers from Cologne, where my father's family comes from. I start with him because he was born only 4 years after me, to parents who were part of a generation who grew up while Germany was starting a long process of facing up to its immediate past. His setting of Todesfuge from 2016 is perhaps the most straightforward of the pieces we will hear, a kind of angry folk blues that punches out the percussive rhythms in Celan's words.
Schwarze Milch der Frühe, wir trinken sie abends, wir trinken sie mittags und morgens, wir trinken sie nachts, wir trinken und trinken. Wir schaufeln ein Grab in den Lüften, da liegt man nicht eng. Ein Mann wohnt im Haus, der spielt mit den Schlangen, der schreibt, wenn es dunkelt nach Deutschland, ein goldenes Haar Margarete. Er schreibt es und tritt vor das Haus und es blitzen die Sterne. Er pfeift seine Rüden herbei, er pfeift seine Juden hervor, lässt schaufeln ein Grab in der Erde, er befiehlt uns, spielt auf nun zum Tanz. Schwarze Milch der Frühe, wir trinken dich nachts, wir trinken dich morgens und mittags, wir trinken dich abends, wir trinken und trinken. Ein Mann wohnt im Haus und spielt mit den Schlangen, der schreibt, wenn es dunkelt nach Deutschland, ein goldenes Haar Margarete, dein aschenes Haar Sulamit, wir schaufeln ein Grab in den Lüften, da liegt man nicht eng. Er ruft, stecht tiefer ins Erdreich, ihr einen, ihr anderen singet und spielt. Er greift nach dem Eisen im Gurt, er schwingt, seine Augen sind blau. Stecht tiefer die Spaten, ihr einen, ihr anderen spielt weiter zum Tanz auf.
Jeremy Corbyn famously said that British Zionists, by which he meant Jews, didn't understand English irony. David Baddiel, in a documentary about Holocaust denial, told this joke. An elderly Auschwitz survivor passes away and finds himself at the gates of heaven. There, in all his glory, stands God. He says to the survivor, "If you can tell me an amusing story about your experiences in the Shoah, I will let you in." The survivor proceeds to tell his best Holocaust joke. God thunders, "That's not funny." To which the survivor replies, "Well, you just had to be there." The Life and Death Orchestra was a British-based ensemble put together to realise a project based on Holocaust literature from a variety of sources. In the same way as mourning manifests itself depending on the individual, the band's treatment of Todesfuge comes across as quite incongruous and dripping with irony.
Black milk at daybreak, we drink it at evening, we drink it at midday and morning, we drink it at night, and we drink and we drink and we drink. A man lives in the house, he plays with his vipers, he writes. He writes when it grows dark to Deutschland, your golden hair Marguerite, your ashen hair Shulamith. We shovel a grave in the sky, there you won't feel too cramped. He shouts, "Jab the earth deeper, you there, you others sing up and play." He grabs for the rod in his belt, he swings it, his eyes are blue. "Jab your spades deeper, you there, you others play on for the dance." Black milk at daybreak, we drink it at evening, we drink it at midday and morning, we drink it at night, and we drink and we drink and we drink. A man lives in the house, your goldenest Har Marguerite, your ashenest Har Shulamith. He plays with his vipers, he shouts, "Play death more sweetly, death is a master from Deutschland." He shouts, "Scrape your strings darker, you'll rise then in smoke to the sky, you'll have a grave then in the clouds, there you won't feel too cramped. Dein goldenes Haar Marguerite, dein ashenes Haar Shulamith." Black milk at daybreak, we drink it at evening, we drink it at midday and morning, we drink it at night, and we drink and we drink and we drink.
More incongruous still is this offering from Norway, which has Todesfuge presented in the context of the kind of music that one might expect to hear as the musical soundtrack of a black and white piece of film noir. For me, this is perhaps the creepiest music we will hear today.
Morgengryets svarte melk, vi drikker den om kvelden. Vi drikker den hver middag og morgen. Vi drikker den om natten, vi drikker og drikker. Vi graver en grav i luften, der ligger man ikke trangt. En mann bor i huset, han leker med ormer, han skriver når det skumrer til Tyskland, ditt hår av gull, Margarete. Han skriver det og går ut foran huset, det funkler i stjerner. Han plystrer hundene hit, han plystrer jødene ut, og byr dem grave en grav i jorda. Han befaler oss, spill nå opp til dans. Morgengryets svarte melk, vi drikker deg om natten. Vi drikker deg hver morgen og middag. Vi drikker deg om kvelden. Vi drikker og drikker. En mann bor i huset. Han leker med ormer. Han skriver. Han skriver når det skumrer til Tyskland, ditt hår av gull, Margarete, ditt hår av aske, Sulamitt.
We now move across the musical divide to a far more serious and sometimes self-reverential world, that of so-called classical music. Felicitas Kukuk's father was Jewish, but changed his name to conceal the fact. Felicitas studied with, amongst others, Paul Hindemith until 1939. Her Jewish roots were concealed on her marriage certificate by a sympathetic German official, which allowed her to survive the war largely unscrutinized by the Nazi authorities. Her setting of Todesfuge reflects the traditional Christian nature of her composition studies.
Morgens
The next three pieces take us from a more tonal, tuneful and melancholy world to a more alien realm, that of modernism, a 20th century movement that encompassed the full gamut of the arts. The movement reflected a desire for the creation of new forms of art, religion, philosophy and social organisation, which reflected the newly emerging industrial world, including features such as urbanisation, new technologies and war. Artists attempted to depart from traditional forms of art, which they considered outdated or obsolete. The poet Ezra Pound's 1934 injunction to make it new was the touchstone of the movement's approach. Modernist innovations included abstract art, the stream of consciousness novel, montage cinema, atonal and 12-tone music. Modernism explicitly rejected the ideology of realism and made use of the works of the past by the employment of reprise, incorporation, rewriting, recapitulation, revision and parody. Laurie Layton's song is at the softer end of the modernists, owing something to Benjamin Britten. It juxtaposes portrayal of the German jackboot with melancholy, tonally rootless passages.
Black milk of daybreak, we drink it at evening, we drink it at midday and morning, we drink it at night, we drink and we drink. We shovel a grave in the ground where you'll want to lie too cramped. A man lives in the house, he plays with his vipers, he writes when it grows dark. To Deutschland, your golden hair, Margareta. He writes it and steps out of doors, and the stars are all sparkling. He whistles his hounds to stay close, he whistles his jewels into rows, as them shovel a grave in the ground. He commands us play up for the dance. Black milk of daybreak, we drink you at night, we drink you at morning and midday, we drink you at evening, we drink and we drink. A man lives in the house, he plays with his vipers, he writes when it grows dark. To Deutschland, your golden hair, Margareta. Your ashen hair, Shulamith.
Israeli composer Tzvi Avni is the first composer to articulate the fugal structure, utilizing a typically Germanic tune as its subject. Many people feel about Harrison Birtwhistle's music the way that the late Thomas Beecham felt about that of Karl-Heinz Stockhausen. He was once asked whether he had ever conducted anything by Stockhausen. His reply, "No, but I trod in some once." Birtwhistle's reading of Todesfuge is at the more extreme end of modernism, foregoing tonality entirely and contrasting angry harshness with stillness and silences. Art always seems to catch up with life, and sometimes indeed runs ahead of it. Just as technology has impacted our contemporary lives in so many ways, just look at the way we're meeting today, so has it impacted music. Who would have imagined then that in post-Soviet Russia, the kind of performance we are about to see would have been produced, and that not only is there an audience for this kind of work, but that it is not shut down by the state.
Черная влага истоков. Мы пьем тебя ночью. Мы пьем тебя утром, и в полдень мы пьем тебя ночью. Смерть — это старый маэстро. Глаза голубее небес. В том доме живет человек. Он змей приручает, он пишет, волос твоих золото Гретхен, волос твоих пепел Рахель. Волос твоих золото Гретхен. Волос твоих пепел, Рахель.
would equally imagine that Celan's work would find a home being set to dance, trance, electronica. The way in which the music changes following the lines, he whistles his Jews to appear, starts us scooping a grave out of sand, he commands us to play for the dance, turning the poem into a strange amalgam of horror and contemporary Totentanz. The dance of death is unsettling, to say the least.
Schwarze Milch der Frühe, wir trinken sie abends, wir trinken sie mittags und morgens, wir trinken sie nachts, wir trinken und trinken. Wir schaufeln ein Grab in den Lüften, da liegt man nicht eng. Ein Mann wohnt im Haus, der spielt mit den Schlangen, der schreibt, wenn es dunkelt, nach Deutschland. Dein goldenes Haar, Margarete, er schreibt es und tritt vor das Haus und es blitzen die Sterne. Er pfeift seine Rüden herbei, er pfeift seine Juden hervor, lässt schaufeln ein Grab in der Erde. Er befiehlt uns, spielt auf nun zum Tanz. Schwarze Milch der Frühe, wir trinken dich nachts, wir trinken dich morgens und mittags, wir trinken dich abends, wir trinken und trinken. Ein Mann wohnt im Haus, der spielt mit den Schlangen, der schreibt, wenn es dunkelt, nach Deutschland. Dein goldenes Haar, Margarete, dein aschenes Haar, Sulamit. Wir schaufeln ein Grab in den Lüften, da liegt man nicht eng. Er ruft, stecht tiefer ins Erdreich, ihr einen, ihr andern singet und spielt. Er greift nach dem Eisen im Gurt, er schwingt's, seine Augen sind blau. Stecht tiefer die Spaten, ihr einen, ihr andern spielt weiter zum Tanz auf. Schwarze Milch der Frühe, wir trinken dich nachts, wir trinken dich mittags und morgens, wir trinken dich abends, wir trinken und trinken.
The idea of the Totentanz, the dance of death, continues into the next piece, this time featuring the violin as a Jewish identity symbol, perhaps referencing the idea in Leonard Cohen's Dance Me to the End of Love. But no one in their right mind would think that an American band that operates on the fringes of the country and western scene would be the creator of the next version of Death Fugue, a stomping, whirling dervish of a dance that pits voice against violin, low brass against electronica, ending with an empty echo of the frenzied life that precedes it.
He calls, play that death thing more sweetly, scrape that thing more darkly, then hover like smoke in the air, then scoop out a grave in the clouds where it's roomy to lie. He commands us to sing for the dance. Castle, a man plays the serpents he rides. Scoop a grave in the clouds where it's roomy to lie. In the castle, a man plays the serpents he rides. Scoop a grave in the clouds where it's roomy to lie.
final piece we'll hear, in my view, unifies the rest and offers us hope. Syrian violinist and refugee Ali Morali's ethereal solo composition, Grave in the Skies, captures a moment beyond the earthly horrors perpetrated by one human on another, and offers a vision of art possibly transcending difference. To conclude, I don't like memorials. They can be used, indeed are used, to support political ends that desecrate the memories of those memorialized. To illustrate this, I would like to leave you with two pictures, in my view, Tisha B'Av appropriate, the sum of which, in my view, do just that.